January 12, 1943. Berlin, Germany. In the heart of Nazi-occupied Berlin, the streets were thick with a biting cold. Snowflakes fell like shards of glass, cutting the sharp air. The world outside was quiet, oppressive, as if under the weight of an unseen hand. The city's pulse was slow, methodical, measured, a rhythm of fear and obedience. It was a place where the wrong glance could lead to a knock on your door, a visit that would change everything. The war had already consumed much of Europe, but in Berlin, it was a living, breathing thing. It was here that truth became the most dangerous currency, traded in whispers and smuggled words, carried by those brave enough to risk it all. Anya was one of those few. She was barely 20, and yet, to the regime, she was invisible. No family, no past, no connections. An orphan, discarded in the system. She had lived in the shadow of the Reich's relentless propaganda machine, but she had always seen through it. The things they told the people, the polished lies that were forced into every home, every mind, Anya knew them for what they were. Lies. Lies that numbed the people, kept them in line. But she wasn't the kind of person who could remain passive in the face of such horror. That morning, the wind howled through the narrow, war-scarred streets as Anya made her way through the city. She had learned to walk quickly, but without appearing hurried, the rhythm of her steps never betraying the urgency beneath. The Gestapo patrols were everywhere, their boots loud, their eyes sharper than knives. She had long since learned how to blend into the background, to become just another face among the thousands trudging through the city. She carried nothing but a small bundle of newspapers wrapped in plain brown paper. Nothing about her suggested the weight of the message she was carrying. The checkpoint was ahead. Her heart rate quickened, but her face remained calm. She had passed through this checkpoint dozens of times before, slipping under the radar, blending into the throng of workers and soldiers heading to and from their destinations. She adjusted the scarf around her neck, pulling it tighter as if it would help to hide her anxiety. As she approached the checkpoint, she forced herself to appear distracted, as though the world was nothing more than a blur around her. "Papers!" a voice called out, and she stopped. She felt the man's gaze before she saw him. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the crowd with the precision of a hawk. He was tall, his uniform sharp, and his presence commanding. Anya's fingers trembled ever so slightly as she reached into her coat, pulling out the required papers. But these were not just any papers. They were letters, pamphlets, journals, every page dripping with truth, every word a betrayal to the regime, smuggled from the underground resistance. Words that would get her killed if the wrong person saw them. She handed him the papers with a smile, calm and disarming. She knew the game. The officer glanced at them quickly, his eyes skimming over the documents, but not reading them. He was only looking for names, a stamp, a signature, something to give him a reason to tear the documents apart, to pull her from the crowd, to send her to a place from which there would be no return. The officer held the papers in his gloved hands, his fingers tracing the edges. For a moment, Anya felt the weight of those moments stretch, an unbearable tension hanging in the air. Every fiber of her being screamed to run, to escape, but her feet remained glued to the pavement. She had done this 1,000 times before, and each time it felt like a gamble. "What are you carrying?" the officer asked. She looked him directly in the eyes, her expression unreadable. "Nothing," she said softly. "Just the usual. Newspapers." She was calm, too calm. Her voice was steady, a practiced indifference. The officer paused, his lips pressing into a thin line. The air between them felt dense, like a storm ready to break. Anya's heart thudded louder now, her breath shallow. This was the moment where everything could go wrong. A single mistake, a misstep, and she would be lost. He stared at her for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a dismissive flick of his hand, he handed the papers back to her. "Move along," he said, his tone cold, uninterested. Anya gave a slight nod, her pulse racing. She didn't wait for him to change his mind. Turning, she walked away, blending once again with the crowd. But she didn't feel relief. Not yet. The checkpoint was only the beginning. It was one of many barriers she had to pass through to reach her destination. The papers she carried contained the truth, the atrocities that the Reich would do anything to bury. The resistance had gathered a network of writers, students, and former soldiers, each contributing to the cause in their own way. And Anya was the messenger. As she continued down the street, her mind raced. The papers she carried told of what the Nazi regime had done to the innocent, to those who had no means of fighting back. They spoke of villages wiped off the map, of families torn apart, of lives snuffed out in a flash. It was the kind of truth that could tear a nation apart. Yet it had to be known. If she didn't do it, who would? But Anya's role was far from secure. She had known the risks from the beginning. No one was invincible, not in a place like this. The Gestapo had eyes everywhere. Trust was a fragile thing, easily broken. A single slip-up, a single betrayal, could end everything. Anya's smile faltered as she walked past a familiar street corner. A shadow shifted in the periphery of her vision. She knew it too well, a man watching her, always in the same spot. She hadn't seen him before, but something about his gaze unsettled her. He was too still, too deliberate. She quickened her pace, heart pounding in her chest. The road ahead felt like it was closing in on her. Every step felt heavier. She had no idea who he was or whether he was a threat. But the feeling of being watched was all-consuming. The resistance had warned her of such moments. It was always the quiet ones, the ones who stood in the shadows, waiting. Anya could only hope that, for once, she would remain unnoticed. But in a city like Berlin, unnoticed wasn't an option for long. The game had begun, and the stakes had never been higher. March 4th, 1943. Dresden, Germany. The weight of secrecy had become a constant companion. Anya had grown accustomed to it. The fear, the tension, the knowing that every step could lead to the wrong eyes. Every glance could be the last. But she had learned how to keep her composure, how to carry her message with the kind of quiet determination that made others believe she was merely another cog in the machinery. The war had cast a long shadow over her life, but she knew, in the deepest part of her being, that she couldn't remain in the dark. She had to fight back. She had to do what others couldn't or wouldn't. Dresden, like most cities in Germany, had become a shell of its former self. Once a place of cultural pride, now it was just a maze of rubble and caution. The air was thick with the stench of burned wood, soot, and defeat. The city was in constant danger of being bombed, and yet it was the perfect place to operate in the shadows. Anya had come here to meet the others, her comrades in the resistance. It was a meeting she had been dreading. The last time they had spoken, things hadn't gone well. She had learned that trust was both a weapon and a liability. It could bind you to others or drag you down. That night, the streets were eerily quiet, save for the distant rumblings of artillery in the background. The air was heavy, like it was about to break apart. Anya moved swiftly, her steps quick but deliberate. She made her way through narrow alleyways, dodging the occasional soldier or civilian, each lost in their own thoughts or fears. It was the kind of night where every sound felt amplified, every movement potentially dangerous. She arrived at the hidden cellar, the place where the resistance gathered. The door was cracked just enough for her to slip through. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the air thick with cigarette smoke. Around a large table sat several people she recognized. There was Karl, an ex-soldier who had witnessed the horrors of the front lines. His eyes were hard now, haunted by things that could never be unseen. Beside him was Maria, a former schoolteacher turned revolutionary. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her face a mask of resolve. She never smiled anymore. Then there was Helmut, a quiet, enigmatic man whose loyalty was unquestionable, but whose silence always made Anya uneasy. And there was Peter, a young poet with a fire in his eyes, the kind of fire that could burn you if you weren't careful. As Anya entered the room, the group went silent. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew why she was here. She carried something far more valuable than mere words. She carried truth, the kind of truth that could set the world on fire, if only it could reach the right ears. "Did you bring it?" Karl asked, his voice low and steady. Anya nodded, pulling a small bundle of papers from under her coat. Each page was precious, each word dangerous. These were not just simple documents. They were pieces of the puzzle. Evidence of atrocities that the Nazi regime had tried to bury. Evidence of the human cost of their war machine. She handed the bundle to Carl, who opened it carefully. His eyes skimmed over the papers, scanning the pages, his expression unreadable. This could change everything, he said, his voice thick with disbelief. Maria leaned in, her face drawn tight. How many more do we have? She asked. Enough, Anya replied, though the truth was she didn't know how many more they had. Every piece of evidence she carried was one step closer to destruction. One more document, one more smuggled report, one more name on a list of those who had vanished. It was all part of the same story. A story that had to be told, no matter the cost. Helmut spoke, his voice low and measured. You know the risks. The Gestapo is everywhere. It won't take long before they catch wind of us. Anya met his gaze, her heart pounding. I know, she said simply, but we can't stop. If we do, they win. The room was silent for a moment, each person weighing her words. There was a moment of hesitation, the kind that comes when you're about to step into the unknown. But there was no turning back. Not anymore. Peter stood up, his face a mix of determination and fear. How can we be sure this will work? He asked. How can we know that people will even believe it when it gets out? Anya didn't hesitate. Because it's the truth. And the truth has a way of finding its way out, even in the darkest places. Carl looked at her, his brow furrowed. And what if it doesn't? What if we're caught before the truth can spread? Anya's hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had to be the one who steadied them, the one who kept them moving forward. We have to trust each other. We can't do this alone. But if we stand together, if we're willing to risk everything, we can make sure the truth gets out, even if it's only for a moment. There was a long pause as each person considered her words. Finally, Maria spoke, her voice soft but resolute. Then we do it. We risk everything. Anya nodded. We do it. The room fell into quiet again, the weight of the decision settling over them. The papers were their lifeline, the spark that could ignite a fire in a world drowning in silence. But even as they prepared for what was to come, Anya felt the first stirrings of doubt. Would they make it out alive? Would the truth survive? The Gestapo was ruthless, and every cell in the resistance was vulnerable. A single betrayal could bring it all crashing down. And then, just as quickly as the meeting had begun, it was over. They each took their share of the papers, the weight of the world heavy in their hands. As Anya stepped back into the streets of Dresden, the city felt more oppressive than ever. The cold wind bit at her skin, but it was the fear in her chest that hurt the most. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if the truth would ever make it past the checkpoints, past the guards, past the spies and informants. But she knew one thing for sure. She had to try. April 25th, 1945. Berlin, Germany. The war was drawing to a close, but the streets of Berlin had not yet yielded to the silence that so often comes with defeat. The city was still alive with a kind of desperate energy, the roar of artillery, the shudder of explosions, and the crackle of the radio. All together, they seemed to create a constant hum of tension, of people unsure whether to rejoice or prepare for what was coming next. Anya had always been able to blend in, to move like a shadow, but now it felt as if the shadows were closing in on her. The world around her was breaking, but in a way, so was she. The final days of the war had arrived with the weight of inevitability. Berlin was surrounded on all sides. The Russian forces were closing in from the east and the Allies from the west. Anya had heard the rumors. The Führer was holed up in his bunker, unwilling to face the fact that everything he had built was coming apart. The city had become a battlefield, a last stand for a regime already defeated in spirit, if not in body. She had been moving through the rubble of the city for days, running errands for the resistance, keeping her head down, doing what needed to be done. Each time she walked the streets, the sense of danger was palpable. The walls seemed to close in tighter with each passing hour. Everyone, from the civilians to the soldiers, was either desperately holding on to their last shreds of hope or quietly accepting that it was over. It wasn't just the city that was crumbling. Anya could feel herself beginning to fray at the edges. The weight of the truth she had carried for so long was starting to take its toll. She had been smuggling evidence of Nazi atrocities for years, taking risks, walking the line between life and death. She had seen friends come and go, lost in the relentless machinery of war. She had witnessed betrayals, false hopes, and the shattered lives of those who had once believed that resistance could change the world. But here she was, standing in the ruins of a city that had been promised greatness, facing the last remnants of the regime that had built it. She had one final task to complete, a final delivery, a final piece of truth to share with those who needed to hear it most. She knew the dangers. The Gestapo had already infiltrated the resistance, and there were whispers of informants among them. But there was no turning back now. She had come this far, and no matter the cost, she would finish what she started. Anya's destination was a small, hidden safe house on the outskirts of the city. There, a group of soldiers, men who had been fighting since the beginning of the war, had agreed to meet with her. She carried with her a set of documents, the most damning yet, a full account of the concentration camps, testimonies from survivors, and a complete list of the Reich's top officials involved in the atrocities. These papers were more than just information. They were the key to exposing the truth to the world. The streets were quieter now, the sounds of battle muffled by the thick smoke that filled the air. As she made her way through the back alleys, her heart was a constant drumbeat in her chest. She could feel the eyes of the city on her, the heavy weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Each step felt like it could be her last. The danger wasn't just from the soldiers or the Gestapo. It was from the very people she was trying to save. The regime had poisoned everything, even the truth. Who could she trust now? By the time she reached the safe house, the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the streets, wrapping everything in a sense of finality. The door to the safe house opened, and a soldier stepped out to greet her. His uniform was worn, the insignia faded, but his eyes, they were the eyes of a man who had seen too much. His name was Eric, and he had been part of the original resistance cell in Berlin. He had fought on the front lines before being forced to retreat back to the city. "Did you bring it?" he asked, his voice rough, tired. Anya nodded, handing him the bundle of papers. Her hands trembled ever so slightly, but she steadied herself. She had come this far, through checkpoints, betrayals, and countless dangers, but now, in this moment, the war had become something more personal. It had become about the cost of truth and whether anyone would care when it was finally revealed. Eric took the papers from her, his eyes scanning the room before he carefully tucked them into a satchel. "This could change everything," he murmured, "if we can get it out of Berlin." Anya nodded again, though a cold knot formed in her stomach. "What if we can't?"